welcome back. We are here still in Woodmead discussing arts and culture and how arts and culture and heritage can help build Africa and build a better world. And that's kind of the focus I'd like to take with this conversation as we start getting into the last sort of few minutes of this. Arthur Mofokate, just before the break, asked a very important question about our resources and we being blamed for corruption and so on and so forth. In fact, the Nigerian president had to defend the continent recently and Europe against the prime minister there. All right, so...
well, it's an interesting one. It's a perception which is out there, peddled all the time, and it becomes worse if it's peddled by Africans. It reminds me of an interview hosted by one interviewer in the United States who was asking Farrakhan whether he knows of any country in the world which is as corrupt as Nigeria. And he looked at him in a surprised way and he said, "Yes, I do. I live in one of them, which is America." You know, and but it's how we interact with the world. It's how we tell our story. People who go out there and tell stories about Africa which are so horrible that you even wonder how they still stay in Africa, the continent, are Africans themselves. The kind of the media we have, we should confront it, because you'll never hear Americans coming elsewhere in the continent and preaching how horrendous America is, which we know that most of the things anyway originated from those parts of the world. So we've got to tell our story. This group of young people here came about, we identified them. In fact, we had an open competition to the entire country on the legacy of Netnakasa, Ken Temba, and others. And we said to them, here is the platform for you. Compete with the world. And he won the Magna Carta International Award. He became the champion internationally. Because if we start telling our story, the adage, the old African adage that until lions have their own historians, the story told will always favor the hunter. You know, because the hunt has no historian. We've got to tell our story. Let's write our own stories through music, through everything, because if we borrow and live in singing about other people's lives and not our lives as Africans, we'll always become second citizens in the world.
Okay, let me ask you, Mfundo, because you're the young ones that are watching and also making these movies now. I remember there was a big debate in the States about movies like Boys in the Hood, New Jack City. They were just perpetuating this ideology about what black men are about. And then in South Africa, we had Tsotsi, Yizo Yizo, and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering, as a young person, the products that you're consuming, are you wanting to see other stories told, or is it okay to tell the whole story, as I think is what's happening at the moment?
Well, I think it's okay to tell the whole story, but when you focus too much on the negative story, then it's not good. And unfortunately, we are sitting in a place whereby young people's successes aren't highlighted very much in the media. And I feel as if that is some place that we can actually work on as a whole. And unfortunately, we sit in this situation whereby I know that demand and supply is one of the reasons why we are in this situation. However, that goes to say that as young people, we need to conscientize ourselves more, to appreciate our culture, to appreciate our heritage and what we have to offer the world as a whole. But also going forward, I think that young people are sort of becoming more educated. We're becoming more prepared to take on this Africa. And so some of the comments that were made, for example, about some of the resources that that leave Africa, I think that that's going to be a thing of the past soon. Because in essence, we are developing the skills that will be necessary to take these resources and make proudly South African and proudly African products, in fact. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Omotoso, I keep wanting to go to this idea of building this continent through arts and culture and our heritage. And yet nowadays, I watch what's happened to some of our cultural things. I mean, lobola used to be a noble thing, a good thing, and there wasn't a lot of money involved. And now you almost have to sell your house to get married. And I'm just wondering, we call it culture. Funerals are now fashion parades more than it is about what it is, and yet we're still calling it culture. And men are cheating on their wives, and they call it culture. And I just wonder that we're promoting all these cultural things, but they're not actually cultural. So, Prof, if you could address that, and then Simphiwe, you can comment.
Each age decides what it wants to emphasize. And they usually come out in phrases. There was a time in Nigeria when all kids in schools, in colleges, in universities were told, you are the leaders of tomorrow. And all of us, of course, pretended that we were the leaders of tomorrow. There was a phrase, life more abundant. Now, in Nigeria, things are, the phrases have changed. We are managing. We are coping. We are trying, In South Africa, we can pick the ages. Before 1994, after 1994. So we really, really determine in the way we use language what we think is important. So it isn't that lobola is not being done. It's just that there are richer people who are able to, splurge. You go to a burial in Ijebu or in Lagos. People buy mint, clean currency notes, which they're going to spray. They put it on when you're dancing, when you are being praised. That's because the resources are there to be used. But it doesn't mean that lobola is not, or the burial of people is not taking place in traditional ways. You'll have to decide, is this what you want? Is this what it should be? When it's your turn to do it, are you going to do it the same way? I mean, somebody in Nigeria buried his mother in a Hummer.
It's a car, by the way, a 4x4.
I mean, culture? Is that culture?
Okay. Simphiwe?
I think as a result of colonialism, we are very wary of interrogating our cultures in honest ways. I think because we were stripped so much of our humanity, and that includes our identity, our cultures, we are then holding on to everything that we have managed to keep throughout the process of colonialism, including the good and the bad. I mean, as a woman here, I have to address this issue of patriarchy that you spoke of. Patriarchy has been a part of cultures across the globe. And many cultures have weaned themselves off patriarchy because, the same way that people have weaned themselves of racism or of the need to colonize, other peoples. Therefore, I think we also have to look at patriarchy in the same light, that it's not necessarily a good cultural practice. It's something that perhaps we would have evolved out of had we not been interrupted by colonialism in our evolution process. Therefore, even things like lobola have to be revisited, and we have to talk about them, because regardless of whether or not we say it's part of culture and it's not buying women, it's, building friendships between the families, how it is viewed by the people that practice it is not necessarily in that light. It is seen in many ways as actually buying a woman, not do global, so you must do A, B, C, and D because do global. So we have to interrogate all of this and look at our culture so that we can wean ourselves of all the things that are bad in our cultures. Because, for instance, if you look at patriarchy, if you look at the rape crisis in South Africa, it is directly connected to patriarchy. As long as men feel they own women's bodies or they have control over them, whenever they get a chance to then defile a woman, who's going to stop them?
Okay. Professor Sonyika, is it the job of these people to correct government when it's failing and write stories and music about government when it's failing and not doing its job? Because there's often a pushback that you're being unpatriotic if you do so.
The important thing is always to remember that volition, the act of choice, belongs to each and every one of us. It's an innate right and responsibility. An exercise in contrast took place just a few days ago in Nigeria when the head of state said for the first time, pronounced for the first time, that one of the retardatory habits or customs which we have is child marriage. I hadn't heard, could have happened, I never heard it. I haven't heard a head of state make that pronouncement very specifically. In contrast to what happened, let us say, some years ago, when the governor of a state, who later became a senator, indulged his tastes for young ones by importing underage girls across the border in marriage. He would drop one when that one reached the age of 13 or 14, and pick one which is about 11 or 12. And when he was challenged about this, when there was a hue and cry, he said, no, my culture, he's a Muslim. He says, my culture permits me to do that. What my culture, my religious culture does not forbid, it means it is permitted. And therefore I can be a pedophile as long as I want. And that marriage was solemnized. And he is a lawgiver. And the laws of Nigeria, so it's not even a question of culture, the laws of Nigeria protect a girl child. You cannot indulge in marriage with an underage woman. But he got away with it. That was many years ago. And he said, because my Islamic culture permits it, which, by the way, was a claim contested by other Muslims. So this is an opportunist, who simply indulged his own warped taste. But finally, now comes a voice. So leadership is so important. I'm waiting to see what will now happen to that individual, because the statutes of limitations has not yet run out. I'm curious, I'm waiting to see what happens now that there's been a pronouncement from the head of state saying you should leave underage girls alone to complete their education. He took that child from school, by the way, and he brought him across the border, brought her across the border, and solemnized, consummated the marriage. So all of us have a huge responsibility.
We're going to take our last break, and then when we come back, we'll start to get some final thoughts on this very huge topic that we've been trying to unpack. Stay with us.